new term, and we are taking a break from geography because we've done 2 terms of geography, because we've looked at map skills and we've looked at coasts, and we're moving on to doing some history. So this live on Tuesdays is for kind of older learners, but everybody is welcome. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the Tudors, and we are going to be also developing our history skills, because lots of things are important with any sort of learning that you do, but actually skills, I think, are the most important, because actually knowledge, although it's important, you can often forget it and just re-look it up in a book. But actually skills, getting you ready for wherever you're going to go and whatever exams you may do in the future, I think is incredibly important. So hello to everybody I can see who is watching live, and everybody who is watching on catch up as well, and we are over on YouTube as well, so welcome if you are watching us on YouTube too. Now, just to say, can we make sure, I put a little kind of disclaimer in the chat before we started, can we make sure that everything, I'd love participation and for you to get as much as you can out of these lessons, but can we make sure that all comments in the chat are relevant to what we're doing. Now we're going to have a quick hello to people, so I can see that. Hello to Jack and Eva and Angel and Max, and lots of families here. I can see lots of hellos, and Isabella and Lily and Roman and Rayhan, and lots of other families that I can see. So I said to you that we were going to be looking at the Tudors. So that's what our kind of 6-week block is going to be about. And today is kind of a bit of an introduction. We're going to think about who were the Tudors, and we're going to think about how did we end up with the Tudors on the throne. So that's kind of what we're going to start with. And what I would like you to think about, because you're going to need a pencil and some paper for this session, because there's going to be lots of things I want you to think about, and you might want to jot them down. But the first thing I want to ask you is, can you draw the Tudor family tree? So when we're talking about the Tudors, we're talking about a specific group of monarchs. Can you draw it? And I don't want to worry about dates, but do you know who's the first Tudor monarch? And do you know then who follows on and follows on from there? Can you draw the Tudor family tree? If you can't and you don't know much about the Tudors at all, that's fine. Can you think of any Tudor monarchs that you may actually know? Can you think of any Tudor monarchs that you may actually know? Because today we are going to be introducing the Tudors, and we are going to be looking at how the Tudors were on the throne of England. And then throughout the 6 weeks, we're going to look at different kind of Tudor monarchs, and we are going to kind of evaluate them, and we're going to discuss what life was like for ordinary people, and we're going to do lots and lots of things. But before we do that, we need to really know who we are talking about. Now, lots of people, and I thought that we would immediately come in with this, lots of you are talking about Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII was definitely a Tudor. He wasn't the first Tudor. He wasn't the top of the family tree, though. But Henry VIII is definitely one of the Tudors. Somebody's written about Elizabeth I, so yes, absolutely. Elizabeth I was the last Tudor. So she was the last member of the Tudor family. Elizabeth I, when she died, she didn't have an heir. And so the family tree moved on to the Stuart line. But yes, Elizabeth I. We've got Mary I, absolutely. We've got Henry VII, awesome. Another one for Henry VII. Anybody else? We're missing 2. Maybe 1, depends on your historical interpretation, but we're missing 2. Shall we go through it? But you're definitely right. Henry VII was the start of the Tudor family tree. He was known as Henry Tudor, and he was the start of the family tree. Now, Henry did have 2 sons. His eldest son sadly died, but his second son was Henry VIII, which I think loads of you knew. And then Henry VIII was followed first of all by Edward VI. Edward VI was his only son. Lots of you are talking about the fact that he had 6 wives and his desperation to have a son. His only son his only legitimate son was Edward VI. Then this is where we get a little bit of an argument here. We then have Lady Jane Grey. She kind of has to stick into the Tudor family tree. She was the queen for not very long. And you may wish to, after this session, go find out some stuff about Lady Jane Grey. Now, then we have Mary I, which lots of you have talked about. This was Henry VIII's eldest legitimate daughter. And then lots of you got it. We have Elizabeth I. And so what we are going to be looking at when we're talking about the Tudors is we are looking at this family tree. Now, what we're, Bloody Mary is one that's sometimes the name used for Mary I. Execution was something that was a punishment in the Tudor times, and so that is kind of why she was synonymous, why she had that name. However, all of the Tudors executed people, and so but that's how she kind of got her name. But yes, when you talk about Bloody Mary, you are talking about Mary I. Now, what we are going to be looking at today is we are going to be looking at the start of this family tree, and we are going to be looking at Henry Tudor. These are the kind of timeline that we're talking about. I say this quite often, you don't have to know dates, but we are talking about the 15th and 16th century when we are talking about the Tudors. And Henry VII became the king in 1485. So although you don't need to know all the dates and all the times when these monarchs ruled, because you could look them up, but it's worthwhile knowing when you're looking at where this fits in history, it's the 15th and 16th century. So it's kind of known as the medieval era sometimes as well. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about then, because I said that we're going to talk about Henry VII and how the Tudor line started. And so I want you to think, we've got quite a few Henrys here. We have Henry IV. This is what Henry IV looked like. We have Henry VI here. We have Henry VII. And I have Richard III. Now, these are all kings. They are all kings that have sat on the throne of England. But does anybody know which king is the odd one out and why? Because this is the start of our story of how the Tudor family came to power. So this is the kind of... what about Henry V? I've just chosen not... There is a Henry V, but I've just chosen not to pop him in right now. But what's the odd one out? So some of you are saying that some of them look richer than the others. That's a good reason. Some of you are saying Richard III. Why? Are you choosing Richard III because he's the only one called Richard? Or are you talking about Richard III for a different reason? So I'd kind of like a because there. So lots of you are writing Richard III. But what's the reason? Are you going for Richard III because he's called Richard? Or are you going for Richard III for another reason? Now, I'd be interesting to know because you could have lots of odd ones out. They are all related, including Richard III. So it's not Richard III. But it's not because he's not related, but it's an interesting one. So lots of people are saying that they're not quite sure. Some of you have picked some of the other Henrys because they look richer than the others. That's a reason. One of the Henrys was crowned but never actually ruled. Maybe we might look at that today. Henry IV because he looks richer. Okay, well, the answer really is, the answer I was getting at was Richard III. Richard III is the odd one out. And Richard III, and some of you are starting to get into this concept of the Yorks and the Lancastrians. But before the Tudor family, and don't worry if you don't know any of this, because this is what we're going to look at today. Before the Tudors, there was a different family on the throne. And they were known as the Plantagenets. So if you're looking at, we've got the Tudors here, and then after the Tudors, you've got the Stuarts. But before the Tudors, you have the Plantagenets. And the reason that Henry Tudor comes to the throne is due to the end of the Plantagenet family line. And it's because of a very famous civil war. Now, a civil war is a war that happens within the country. Britain or England has had 2 civil wars in history, but one of the civil wars was known as, what does anybody know? Well, it was known as the War of the Roses, and it's because it was between 2 factions of royalty. You had the House of Lancaster and the House of York, and they both wanted to be on the throne of England. They both wanted to be in control of the throne of England. Now, we're going to look at why a little bit, because you need to understand, in order to understand about Henry Tudor, you need to understand the past that he's come from, where he's come from. And so you need to understand a little bit of the War of the Roses, which is what we're going to do. Now, the War of the Roses is a humongous topic. I used to teach it when I was a school teacher, and I used to probably take maybe 8 to 10 weeks teaching young people for maybe 3 times a week. So it's a huge topic and not one we're doing now. But we do need to know something about the War of the Roses, because you need to understand, in order to understand about Henry VII's reign on the throne as the king, you need to understand where he's come from. And really where he's come from, and you can see a huge red arrow here, is Edward III. So the Plantagenet line starts with Edward III, and we're all the way back in 1327, so over 100 years before Henry VII comes to the throne. Now, Edward III has an awful lot of children. His eldest son, however, who was supposed to be on the throne of England, sadly dies. And so his heir dies, his eldest son dies before Edward III. And so after Edward III, we have Richard II. And Richard II was the grandson of Edward III. So that's kind of what you have to understand, is that we don't, well, what are they all fighting for? I'm going to tell you, Alicia, because it's really then becomes not necessarily the War of the Roses, which is what it's called, but it becomes a war of cousins, because you have Richard II, but he isn't really the immediate heir because his dad has died. So he becomes the king of England as the grandson, and then after him we get Henry IV, and then after him we get Henry V. And so they are, you've got those kind of, that sort of line goes through. But then we have a problem, because then we get to Henry VI. And we've had this bit of an issue because, as I said, Richard II is actually the grandson of Edward. And then Henry IV, can you put your finger on Henry IV? He has the rather smashing red hat on. Henry IV is another grandson of Edward III. Because when Richard II dies, he also doesn't have an heir. So you have Edward III, and then the first king after Edward III is one of his grandsons. And then when he dies, there's another grandson. And the grandson is Henry IV, and he is the child of Edward III's third son. So you then have these kind of grandchildren ruling, and it gets a little bit complicated, and I don't really want you to worry about it until we get to Henry VI. So we've had these kind of grandsons, and then a son in Henry V, and then we get to Henry VI. Now, Henry VI is on the throne, and Henry VI sadly gets a little bit poorly, and it's written down as in lots of texts that he went mad. Now, we don't really know what happened to Henry VI, but he was poorly, he was unwell, he was not fit to rule. it's written down, as I said, that he went mad. And so because he wasn't really in any state to rule the country, that you have somebody that steps up and offers to help. And that person is known as Richard of York. Now, Richard of York was also a descendant of Edward III, because Edward III had so many children. And so Henry VI goes mad, and so his family relative, Richard of York, steps up and becomes the protector of the throne. And he says, do you know what? Because I've been kind of helpful to you, I'd like to be the king after you. Because Henry VI does get better. He's only poorly for kind of just over a year, and he gets better, and he becomes the king again and says to Richard of York, I don't need your help anymore. And Richard of York's like, well, I stepped up and helped you when you were poorly, so when you die, I'd like to be king. Or when you die, I'd like my son to be king. And this is what starts the War of the Roses, because you have these two separate groups of people, they're cousins, they are both, well, they're all descendant of Edward III, but this is what starts this war. And you have Henry VI, and then you have Edward IV. And Edward IV, he is the son of Richard of York, who has helped Henry when he was poorly. And so what you have is you have a big argument. You have an argument between the cousins over who should be in charge. And it sets the country into a huge war. And we're not going to go into that because it's not particularly, it is relevant, but the ins and outs of that war aren't relevant. You just need to understand that there was this war between two cousins, two sides of a family, over who should be king. So it's a little bit, I suppose, like Romeo and Juliet, where you've got two rival families. This is two rival sets of cousins. Edward IV kind of wins. He becomes king. Henry VI, we don't really know what happens to him. Some records say he died because he was sad. Some say that he was murdered, but we don't really know what happened to him. But Edward IV, he becomes the king. But then when he dies, we have Edward V. Now, Edward V is a child, and so he can't really rule. He's only 12. And so Richard III comes in, and Richard III is an uncle. And so he says, oh, I'll be a really lovely uncle. I'll help Edward V be the king, because he's only 12, and he doesn't know what he's doing. However, while this is happening, there's lots of arguing over who should really be on the throne, because the family tree is really messy. And as I said, if you've got confused, I don't blame you, because everybody's going, well, I should be the king. I am a descendant of Edward III. No, I should be the king because I'm a descendant of Edward III. And so Richard III, he says, oh, well, you know, I'm kind of a descendant of Edward III. And Edward V's a bit too young, so I'll just rule as in his place. I'll just be the protector of England for him. But then things kind of happen, and again, we're not entirely sure. But Edward V, who was never crowned, gets sent to the Tower of London with his brother, and nobody really knows what happened to him. There's lots of rumours that he was murdered, but they've never ever found any kind of real evidence of that, but it's a bit of a mystery. So Richard III says, well, no, I'll just be the king because, you know, I'm amazing. And so Richard III is the king. But Henry Tudor, if you look back at our family tree quickly, can you see we've got Henry Tudor there, Henry VII. And Henry VII, he kind of does also have a claim to the throne. So when he's younger, he is sent away because his mother is incredibly worried that he might get bumped off by one of the other rival members of the family. So he's sent to France and he's sent away to hide. But while he is away hiding, he has lots and lots of support. So we have Richard III, who is now the king, and he makes all of the decisions, but he isn't really very popular. And so lots of people aren't really sure about Richard III. They weren't even really sure about Edward either. They don't really know who should be king. And so what we have is we have some support that begins to amass for Henry Tudor. And one of the reasons that support for Henry Tudor amasses is because he says, look, I'll end all of this war. What I'll do is I will marry Edward IV's daughter. And what we'll do is that then we'll have one side of the family and the other side of the family, and we'll get married, and then we all have then, parts of us are all on the throne because we'll have children, and then we will have united the Lancastrians and the Yorks together. And so Richard III is losing lots of power, and he doesn't actually have a legitimate heir because his sons died, and so they have a huge war, and it kind of culminates at the Battle of Bosworth Field. And in the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard III is slain and defeated and killed, and Henry Tudor becomes the king. Now, whew, if you don't understand some of that, as I said, I don't blame you. And if you're still listening and you're still there, then absolutely awesome. But all you really need to do is, for over 100 years, cousins had all been arguing over who was on the throne. And we have this scenario where Henry Tudor says, I will finish it, I will marry the other side of the family, and then I can unite and end the War of the Roses. And this is the start of the Tudor line. So he marries the Elizabeth of York, and so this is how you get the Tudor rose, because you can see the emblem of the Lancastrians and the emblem of the Yorkists, and they put them together, and that's how you get the Tudor rose. But do you think that Henry Tudor should have been the king? Because his claim to the throne was a little bit tenuous, and that's because he was illegitimate. Now, does anybody know? I've used that word a lot because I've also said about Henry VIII. Henry VIII had more children than I've shown you on the family tree, because lots of his children were illegitimate. What does illegitimate actually mean? Do you know? But Henry Tudor was the great-great-great-grandson of Edward III. Now, you could argue that there were lots of other cousins who had a far more legitimate claim to the throne. Absolutely, Izzy B. It means his parents are not married. So it was quite a common occurrence in this era for a king to marry, but they would often marry due to politics. So they would marry because it was a good ally to have. So you might marry a princess from France or a princess from Spain because it's a good kind of political thing to do. But then what you find is they don't actually love each other. So most monarchs in this era had mistresses, so they had girlfriends, if you wish, that they actually probably did love. And so they had children with those girlfriends or mistresses whilst they were married to somebody else. And so that's exactly what's happened in Henry Tudor's family tree. He was actually illegitimate because his family, although he was related to Edward III, he had been born out of marriage, and so lots of people think he was never ever supposed to be the king anyway because he was illegitimate. But he is the king, and he has become the king after over 100 years of fighting and squabbling and cousins arguing. And the reason I've told you very quickly a potted history of the War of the Roses is because it's incredibly important to understand where Henry Tudor has come from and how it impacts on his rule as king. So if you have spent all your time fighting, you are now the king, you have lots of your family and nobles and royals and other people all arguing. It's a bit like the royal family today. There's lots of arguing and squabbling. What would you do? How would you ensure that you remained the king? Because you've still got all your fighting cousins behind you. You're actually illegitimate. So you probably have quite a tenuous claim to the throne. You are on the throne now. How are you going to ensure that you end the War of the Roses and you are a successful king? What would you do? It's a very difficult question, but I'd love to know what you would do. Do you want to take maybe 30 seconds to a minute to just put your thinking hat on and have a little think? So you've come from all of this fighting. In fact, way before you were even born, they were fighting over who could be the king. So you're now sat on that throne. What are you going to do? How are you going to make sure that the civil war doesn't carry on? How are you going to make sure that as king you are in a really strong position? How are you going to stop all of the cousins fighting? So I'm going to stop talking because I know you need to think. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Off you go. I am loving some of these answers. So lots of you are saying that you need to eliminate anybody that might threaten you. So some of the ideas that you've got is that you create a war somewhere and you send all your enemies to fight for you in a war, so that then they may sort of get bumped off, I suppose. Some of you are saying have an heir as quickly as possible, ACB. That's an amazing one and a really important one. If you have a line of heirs, lots of the reason that the War of the Roses happened was because there was no obvious heir to the throne. And so, yeah, having an heir would be absolutely important. Give all your supporters a position of power. Absolutely brilliant. Have a family dinner. I love that. That is an awesome idea. Have a family dinner. Marry one of the enemies and then poison all of your enemies or send them to war. Absolutely. That would work possibly. It might be a big deal, though, to try and get rid of everybody who's a threat to you, to poison everybody that is a threat to you. You might upset people. Make some new laws, Noah says, to keep your position secure. I love it. That's a really good one. Bribe the civilians. So bribe all the sort of bribe all the other people that, all the nobles that are in power. So, yeah, really, really good. But this is a big issue for Henry Tudor, because what we do know, because we obviously are looking back in time, is that he did do a great job at remaining the king, and he did stop the War of the Roses, and he did start a long line of further Tudors. But how did he do it? And that's what we're going to look at. So I know that the War of the Roses was a bit like, and do go and read up some more about it if you're interested. But it's important to know he has come from what's known as, I suppose, a tumultuous or a very, very unsettled England. And so that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at what he did. Now, you're going to need some paper and some and a pencil. This is called a diamond 9. Now, I'm going to talk to you about 9 things that the king did to secure his power. Putting poison in food would be a very good one, Jay. But I'm going to give you 9 things he did in order to remain the king and to start off a strong line of Tudor monarchs. Now, you are going to decide which one you think is the most important thing that he did. And you're going to write that number where it says number 1, so right at the top of your page. So I'm going to give you 9 things. So if you think number 3, you don't know what number 3 is yet. But if you think number 3 is the most important thing he did, you're going to write 3 at the top of your page. If you're good at making notes, you might then summarise that in a sentence so that you remember what number 3 said. Then you're going to think of the next 2 things he did, which you think made him a good monarch at keeping control. And you're going to write those numbers underneath. And if you want, a little sentence about why. Then the next 3 things in order of importance, and then 2 that you don't think were particularly important, and the one at the bottom is something that you don't think was very important whatsoever. And it's called making a diamond 9 of evidence. And it's a really good tool that you can use to sort your thoughts out when you are doing history and you're looking at lots of evidence around an event or around something, in this case, the reign of Henry VII. Now, it is interpretation, which means it's entirely up to you. There is no right answer. And that's what I love about history, because as long as you can argue what your answer is, it doesn't really matter. There is no definite answer. There is no perfect answer, single correct answer as to why Henry VII was able to remain in control and start off the Tudor dynasty. As long as you can explain it, that's entirely up to you. So that's what we're going to do. I hope it makes sense. We're going to make this diamond 9. And so you're going to work out what you think should be at the top and so on. So I'm going to go through some of the evidence. And so you need to decide what you think was important. Now, if the diamond 9 is too tricky, you can just rank them. So the most important down to the least important. So the first one, which a lot of you talked about, is marrying one of the enemies, and that's exactly what he did. So he married Elizabeth of York. Now, Elizabeth of York was the daughter of Edward IV, and so this marriage meant that the fighting between the 2 families ended because they were now one. There was no argument about, well, I'm a Lancastrian and I want to be on the throne. Well, no, I'm a York and we should be on the throne, because you, in theory, had a Lancastrian and a York on the throne because you have a king and a queen. And if they have an heir, then you have a mix of York and Lancastrian in that heir. And so therefore, there is no legitimate reason to be arguing anymore. Now, this may come as a bit of a shock or maybe be a bit sad, but he didn't really love Elizabeth of York at all. It was absolutely something that he did to secure his control of the throne. He did not love Elizabeth of York. It was not, some romantic marriage. It was purely a logistical reason to secure his place on the throne. So he married Elizabeth of York, so you have York and Lancaster on the throne. So therefore, his argument is, you can't argue with me anymore. You can't push me off the throne because there's two sides of the family represented here. So that's the first thing he did. Moving on from that, because it's purely political, that marriage was purely political, and it wasn't done out of love. It shows how strong his desire was to kind of win, how strong his desire was to remain on the throne, because I think it must be very hard to marry somebody that you don't love. Elizabeth has 2 sons, so when we're talking about heirs, which is another thing, have an heir as quickly as possible. He did have 2 sons. He had an heir and a spare, so he had Arthur, who was his eldest son, and then he had Henry, who becomes Henry VIII. But he has his heir was Arthur, his spare was Henry VIII, an heir and a spare, and so from a monarch's perspective, 2 sons, he's done a great job there. The next thing he did was he passed a law that banned any private armies in England. Because what had happened in the War of the Roses was that very, very rich nobles, like the Earl of Warwick, if you've ever been to Warwick Castle, the Earl of Warwick is an example of this. They were rich, and so they could pay people to be in their own private army. And so what you have is earls and nobles being able to amass their own armies, and as a result of that, they are able to threaten the crown. So if they don't have somebody on the throne that they like, they can amass a private army and then overthrow that person. It's a bit like somebody rich today amassing a private army in order to overthrow the Prime Minister. Now, what Henry VII does is he makes that illegal. He says you are no longer allowed anybody to have a private army. The only person who is allowed to have an army is me, and nobody else can have an army, which meant that he was incredibly safe, because if you can't amass an army against him, then you can't get rid of him. The next thing he did was he made anybody who was very, very rich pay him lots of money. So he sent out people to go out all around England and look for very expensive houses and to knock on their doors and say, you need to pay a loan to the king because you need to support the king with wars and security, so you need to pay him some money. And it's a loan. However, a bit sneaky, he never paid any of those loans back, which meant that he had lots of money to spend on guards, but it meant that the nobles didn't have any money to fight against him because they'd given him their money. The other thing he did with all this money from these pretend loans that he'd made all the rich pay, he invested in the military. So he made sure that he had the best cannons and that he was developing weapons. And so everybody knew that his army was the strongest and the best army going. And so if you've got a really strong army with state-of-the-art weapons behind you, it makes you very, very, very secure on that throne. Now, the next thing he did, because England and France had had a lot of arguing over history, and there'd been a few wars with France, and there are a few more wars to come under Henry VIII, but under Henry VII, he says to France, if you pay me money, we won't invade you. And so France pays him piles of money so that England doesn't invade them. But then he says to the nobles, oh, we might need to invade France. They might be a bit of a threat. You need to pay me so that I can fight France. It's a bit naughty, isn't it? Or is it very clever? So he gets France to pay him so that he doesn't invade them. And then he lies to the nobles and says to the nobles, oh, pay me some money so that I can protect us against France. Cunning. The next thing he does is Spain is incredibly powerful at this time. And so he makes his son, his eldest son, his heir, Arthur, marry the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. And so he makes that political allegiance with Spain. Now, Spain are a humongous military, powerful nation. And so by marrying his eldest son to a princess in Spain, he secures himself an ally in Spain. So he knows if anybody tries to threaten me as the King of England, I can get Spain to come and support me because my son is married to their one of their princesses. Now, not really important for right now, but Henry VIII ends up, Arthur dies, Henry VIII is the spare, he isn't even expecting to be king, but he then, when Arthur dies, he instead marries Catherine of Aragon to ensure that that allegiance stays. So even when his son dies, he says to his second son, well, you'll have to marry her now because we still need this allegiance in Spain. So I know your brother married her, but now you have to marry her. Now, he showed everyone he was really rich and powerful. So a lot of things that Henry Tudor did, and this is something that was discussed right back at the beginning, he made sure that he looked really rich. He wore expensive clothes, he threw expensive parties, and he wanted everyone to know that I'm the boss. I'm absolutely the boss. By persona, by looking the part. The other thing he did was he made sure he thought about the general public. So in these days, you didn't really have a middle class. You either had an upper class, the nobles and the rich, or you were incredibly poor. Now, Henry had a hospital built for the poor. He also encouraged trade. He also encouraged discovery. If any of you live near to Bristol, he funded John Cabot's exploratory trip to America. So he also made sure that he was thinking about developing England as well, with commerce and discovery and supporting the poor. Do you know at first he wanted to marry her, but then, oh, there we go. No, I didn't know that. But yeah, so those are all of the things that Henry Tudor did. So what do we think? What do we think? What do you think is the most important thing that Henry Tudor did to keep the crown? So we're going to go for the top one. Okay, I'm going to give you some to think about these. I want you to have a little think. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think what you think the most. Let's go for the top three. So your one and the two underneath. So your most important and the second two important. And I want some whys. Why do you think that Henry Tudor kept the crown? What was the most important things he did? Are you ready? Off you go. Okay, so most people think number one. Now, remember, when we're developing our skills, you need to explain why. So, for example, some of you have chosen either one or number two. So, number one, he married Elizabeth of York is the most important, but why? Why is that the most important? So, for example, because he ended the family warring, because it meant that there was no legitimate reason to overthrow him, because he had united the two sides of the family. Lots of you are saying that you think it was the second one because he produced two heirs. Why? Well, again, because it means that you're not going to then have arguing over who should rule after him. Who should rule after him? You've got no argument. It's pretty obvious. Arthur rules after him, and then if Arthur doesn't survive, the second Henry, his second son Henry will rule. So that explanation. Some people are saying that banning armies in England was important because it would prevent any sorts of civil war. So you can come back to these slides when the live has finished, because I'd really like you, if you really want to develop these skills, to actually explain you're like write if you can write or get someone to scribe or type, how did he keep the crown in a paragraph? The most important reasons were because. So rather than saying 1, 3 and 6 or 9, 4 and 2 or 9, 8 and 3, why is it those? Okay. The last thing is, how should he be remembered? This is something you can take on and have a little chat about at home. How should he be remembered? Well, he definitely should be remembered as ending the War of the Roses, and he definitely should be remembered as starting the Tudor line, the Tudor dynasty. But go and find out some more about Henry VII and what he did, because Henry VII, how should he be remembered? He's not the man with 6 wives, that's his son, that's Henry VIII. But how should Henry VII be remembered other than ruling and ending the War of the Roses? But definitely, if you want to, you could write some really good work or make a poster, do some drawing or a cartoon strip or something like that of how did he keep the crown, using all those connectives like because and therefore, and using evidence to support your view. But he was a clever man who established a dynasty through his own actions. I think, Jack, that is an awfully good thing to say as an end to the session. I would absolutely agree with you. He was an incredibly clever, cunning man, and he did in order to establish that dynasty. And I think, although it's very, very naughty, my favourite thing about Henry Tudor is the fact that he convinced France to give him money, and so that he wouldn't go to war with them. And he convinced the nobles to give him money to fund the war with France. I think that, for me, is what makes him incredibly clever. So yes, Jack, I definitely agree with you. And he did end the War of the Roses. He did start the Tudor dynasty. And next week we are going to be looking at Henry VIII. And we are going to be looking again at this concept of interpretation, because everybody's talked about Henry VIII today, and all you've said about him is the fact that he had 6 wives. Now, we're going to look a bit more about Henry VIII. We're not actually going to even talk about his wives next week, because we're going to look at Henry VIII and the type of monarch that he was. And we're going to, again, look at interpretation. But have a lovely rest of the week. Do send me some work if you do any work on how Henry Tudor kept the crown, and I will see you soon.